Anyway, so let's talk about the book.
Okay, great. Thank you for holding it up. I love the photograph.
Yeah.
So that cover photograph is by Caitlin Cronenberg. David's
by who?
Caitlin Cronenberg. It's David Cronenberg's daughter.
Oh, I was going to say, what a coincidence. They have the same last
name.
Yeah,
exactly. No, he has a son who's a filmmaker, Brandon Cronenberg. And
I've seen his films. Yeah.
Yeah. And Caitlin has been a photographer for a while, and she's like a very successful portrait photographer.
Dune here or in Canada?
I guess Toronto. She's in Canada. I don't know for sure, but it seems like she's based in Toronto.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyhow, I love that picture of him. So I was glad I was able to get it for the book.
He has dreamy eyes. I'll give him that.
He is. Yeah, he does.
You edited a compilation, I guess, of interviews that have stood out in your experience about with the this auteur filmmaker. Mm-hmm. And I know that some time ago, maybe about is it possible it was in the 90s, where you actually programmed a retrospective of his films, in fact.
Yeah, it was one of my first big retrospectives at the Museum of the Moving Image. Like, the museum opened in 1988. And Cronenberg was, by that time was already one of my favorite working contemporary filmmakers. And he was taking on this big project. Started working on this like about a year before Naked Lunch was released. And it was the first time I did a retrospective at the museum that was coordinated with the release of a film. It's actually a formula that I think dates back to Peter Bogdanovich doing that with Museum of Modern Art. He did
he did a couple. I think he did an Orson Welles, but he also did a
Hitchcock one.
Oh, excuse me, a Hitchcock. But
Hawks, probably Howard Hawks.
That's right.
But he did a Hitchcock one when, and that was in conjunction with The Birds coming out.
Oh, funny.
And it was. Anyhow, that's a whole other story, but I was just, very taken with Cronenberg, and we did a complete retrospective. That was a time in his career when he wasn't too far removed from his, reputation as a horror movie director. And this was like I guess you would call Naked Lunch an art house movie, but it happened to be released by a major studio. That year Fox released both Barton Fink and Naked Lunch. And
I think it was this,
which were both commercial disasters, but critical favorites, but commercial disasters.
The interesting connection between those two,
right?
Like the Coens at that time, especially, and Cronenberg, I could see those films kind of being a double feature too. Fargo.
That would be a good double feature.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think Joe Roth was running Fox at the time, and after those films came out, he said Fox is out of the art house business now. He was. But anyhow, I met Cronenberg. I worked it was a lot of work putting that retrospective together. We did the New York premiere of Naked Lunch, and we also premiered a really good behind the scenes documentary called Naked Making Lunch by Christopher Rodley. And Cronenberg came to New York, and I've met him a number of times over the years. I think I've interviewed him about 5 or 6 times, and it just sort of became a tradition. Whenever a new film came out, I would usually try to present it at the museum and do an interview with him.
Right. Well, why didn't you just decide to do a book of your? Were those Q&As? I mean, are you talking about when you say you interviewed him 5 or 6 times?
When I interviewed, everything that I did with him was for public programs. It was a series at the museum called the Pinewood Dialogues. and he would just come and you know, and talk, and he was brilliant, you know. And
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about Cronenberg, you know, I'm sure you've interviewed a lot of filmmakers, and you know, when filmmakers are almost invariably like incredibly smart and level-headed, and even if they make crazy movies, it doesn't mean that they're crazy. You know, you can't really be. And there was this famous story where Scorsese and Cronenberg met, and Scorsese said to Cronenberg, I was really a little afraid to meet you because, you know, I'd seen movies like Scanners and The Brood, and I'd seen these horror movies, and I was like afraid to meet you in real life. And of course, Cronenberg says, like, Martin Scorsese is telling me this, the guy who made Taxi Driver.
Yeah, right.
You know, the people like Cronenberg, if, you know, when you meet him, he's the most like urbane, funny, easygoing guy you can imagine. You know, yet he makes these films that you know, get in touch with a lot of dark forces and are very graphic and violent. So there's a dichotomy there.
Yeah.
But it was always fun to interview. But I did have a sort of traumatic, I mean, somewhat traumatic experience. I did a lot of like preparation for the interview. It was like early on in my, you know, interviewing career. Like I've interviewed hundreds of filmmakers, but this was one of the first major ones I did. And I came prepared with all these sort of heavy questions, you know, theoretical questions. And I asked this very long-winded question at the beginning of our first conversation on stage. And David said something like, oh, wait, are you my friend or my enemy? And then he said, why don't we just take audience questions? And he was,
yeah.
And I know what he was doing. Like a filmmaker doesn't want to be too theoretical about their work. You know, they want to be their films might be filled with ideas, but you know, a filmmaker does not want to really explain their work, right? So they want to. So, and you know, and again, I'm telling you this. You've interviewed. You know, you've interviewed countless filmmakers.
Yeah, but I don't think about these issues unless I'm talking to somebody else who's done that too. So go on.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't know that I think about it all the time. But go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So exactly. So but anyhow, it was, you know, it was a learning experience for me. But the, you know, the thing about Cronenberg, he's incredibly entertaining, and he'll
Right.
talk, you know, in this book, like when you're reading through these interviews that are collected in the book, he's constantly referring to different authors and philosophers, and he's filled with ideas. You know, his movies are movies about ideas.
Definitely.
And so he's a great interview. But, and also like he kind of, when he's up on stage and when he's talking to a journalist, he's sort of performing.
That's right. That's what I was gonna say that I was gonna I bet there is a difference between how he wants to speak about his films in a printed or written interview as opposed to something in front of an audience. I could definitely understand that he's trying to be a little bit more proletarian or whatever, man.
Yeah, when he's on stage, you're right. When he's doing a press conference or he's on stage in front of an audience, he's like a Jewish comedian. You know, he's trying to be entertaining.
Yeah.
And he's very, very funny. He's one of the funniest people I've ever met. I mean, he's hilarious.
I only seen him once in public.
What was that for?
I think it was his last film. In fact, he was Maps of the Stars. I think he at Walter Reed. You know.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I think that's where I saw him interviewed. I can't remember who was from the committee who was talking to him, but
yeah,
it was a treat because you know I've been such a fan.
He's definitely a treat. So, but he's always been a favorite filmmaker of really serious critics, you know, very intellectual critics, and as a result, there's just great interviews out there with people, you know, the people in the book who do interviews include Amy Taubin and Gavin Smith and Dennis Lim.
Any of those might have been the ones I saw interview.
Yeah, exactly.
When did he first come on your radar, by the way, as a young guy? When did you?
I have a very strong memory of that. It was Videodrome.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
No, okay. Scanners. Excuse me. Go ahead. But go ahead.
Okay. And I really got serious about film in the late 70s, like around 78, 79. And then I transferred. I was going to Columbia University and then transferred to Purchase, to go into a film program. And this was like just the early 80s, of course, was just the very beginning of home video. Go movies on video cassette, on VHS. So I think that's the first way that I saw Videodrome. And, it's such an interesting experience to, pop a cassette, a Videodrome into your TV and into your VCR. And it's such a, meta film. It's a film all about the medium, about the difference between film and video. And it just was brilliant, sort of playing around with all these ideas about cinema itself and about images. And it sort of had everything to me. It had ideas. He was obviously a filmmaker who was influenced by Marshall McLuhan. That's one of the names that's dropped a number of times in the book.
Yeah.
So that just struck me as a brilliant film. It was, right at the time that when it came out was a great period for horror movies. Directors like John Carpenter and George Romero were in their prime. So he sort of fit into that group of filmmakers. Yet I had all these like interesting ideas to sort through. So I was convinced when I saw Videodrome that he was a major filmmaker, and then I just followed him very closely ever since.
But I do recall, I remember when I was in high school at Scanners, I remember seeing those trailers for it, and it freaked me out a little bit. Like the body, the head's exploding, it freaked me out. Like what not horror per se, like the traditional horror was okay, but there's something about what he was doing got inside of me, like it got in my head, and it was disturbing, I guess is a better word, disturbing images and things that, the same thing in Scanners. Well, and so I was very, intimidated with the idea of seeing his films until much later.
Yeah. I mean, some of the words that you just used when you talk about him, about being inside your head and getting in your head, the very specific thing that Cronenberg is always interested in is this idea that to him, all the horror comes from within, comes from inside of us, and that can mean different things. But like one of the things he says somewhere in the book, he's talking about Jaws and Steven Spielberg's Jaws. And he said, the shark is scary, but he's more interested in the horror that comes from inside of us. And literally his very first significant commercial feature film is called Shivers, but also was released as They Came From Within. And it was, set in an apartment complex in Montreal where this sort of parasitic bug was, invaded the bodies of the people who lived there. And it transformed the people into sort of sex-crazed monsters. And that's a very overt metaphor for this idea of horror coming from inside. His films have always stuck to that idea. So that Videodrome, almost like, I think almost the last half of the movie is entirely subjective. We're entirely inside the mind of James Woods' character. We sort of leave reality. And this happens in a number of his films. They become very internal. They take us inside, and that's consistent throughout his films. But he's really interested in what's going on inside our brain, but then he ties that in with what's going on inside of our body. So he's a cerebral director. He's all about ideas, but he, in one form or another, he's always reminding us that a human being is this very physical creature, animal that is
Right.
going to decay and transform and decompose, and we're bound to our bodies.
Did you either in your studying of him, your research, and in your getting to know him, did you get a sense of where he found how he found his voice? Because he is a filmmaker, as we both have already kind of alluded to, with a very unique voice.
I mean, it's a great question, like where he came from, and you always associate his early career with these horror movies that he made in the beginning. He did That Came From Within, and it was very shocking for a Canadian director at that time to be working that way.
Right.
There was the real tradition at the time in Canadian cinema was a kind of realism, and most characterized by the documentaries that the National Film Board of Canada was making, but most of the narrative filmmakers, at that time that Cronenberg was coming into his own as a filmmaker, were working in the style of realism. So it was pretty subversive for him to take on horror, much more so than an American filmmaker doing that. But a really important thing to understand about Cronenberg is that he came from he was very well read. He came from a very literate background. He talks in one of the interviews in the book about he grew up surrounded by books. He had his parents were very sophisticated. His mother was a musician.
Right.
And his interests were quite avant-garde early on. He actually started a filmmakers cooperative in Toronto that was based on the filmmakers co-op in New York City. And so that New York experimental scene with Andy Warhol,
right,
and others, Stan Brakhage and other filmmakers, like he was very, very interested in that. So that's sort of important to keep in mind. It's not like he was somebody who grew up watching B horror movies. That's not what he saw. He was watching avant-garde film. His first films that he made were experimental features of Stereo and Crimes of the Future, which were not commercial films at all. They were very independently made films. And he at some point he realized that he wanted to work in film and work out these ideas, but also reach an audience and also like participate in the commercial side of filmmaking. He tells a story about going to he lived in France for a while in the 60s, and he went to Cannes one year, and he really went there his first time as like an artist, and the whole spectacle of the Cannes Film Festival he couldn't really make sense of. But then he went back a few years later to Cannes and had a whole different attitude. It sort of showed him that it made him think that there's a place for him in the realm of commercial cinema, and that's what he has always been, a sort of subversive avant-garde artist working within the commercial medium of film. And he's had some commercial successes like The Fly.
Fly was huge. Even was Dead Zone a success at the time?
I think Dead Zone. He had that period when Dead Zone was successful. I think later on, like History of Violence, but he, for the most part, has made sort of very uncompromising art house films.
That's right.
And never, he was never going to be a director like a Steven Soderbergh or even Richard Linklater, who sort of moves back and forth between making very personal films and very commercial films. Like one of the things I love about
not as a strategy anyway.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I love about Cronenberg's body of work is that, there's a real integrity to it. And, he's definitely had some commercial success and some hits. But he seems to really make the films that he wants to make. And
so he's had to make a sort of be okay with sort of remaining under the radar to some degree in general.
Yeah.
As a filmmaker, like he's entered the popular culture because he's also just been around a long time.
Yes. Yeah.
But
yeah. Yeah, he's in his 70s now. I hope he continue. You know, he's slowed down as a filmmaker.
He's very prolific, though.
Yes, but
been very prolific.
He has been prolific, but he also doesn't seem like somebody who's just going to crank out commercial work, you know,
right.
to keep going. Like
well, part of that is, I'm sure, the search for money and distribution and all that, right? That's not as easy as some maybe.
Yeah. Now, supposedly he's making a film. I mean, apparently he's doing a project with Viggo Mortensen, and they had some great films together with History of Violence and Eastern Promises. And they're apparently doing a movie that's in the vein of his horror, you know, earlier horror movies.
Oh, really?
So that's exciting. But
it is. Yeah.
You know, like I actually love some of the recent work. Cosmopolis, I'm a big fan of, and I like Maps to the Stars a lot. But those were, you know, not.
I agree.
Commercial successes by any means, or critical.
No, but you see an artist, you see a filmmaker who is not just repeating himself, who's not doing things that are, I mean, he's definitely still doing probably for the most part what he wants to. I'm not saying he doesn't compromise, you know, maybe he chooses certain actors in a more strategic way, but you know, these aren't like surefire hits here, you know.
No, not at all. Even though he's working with Robert Pattinson,
exactly.
You know,
yeah, and in
Cosmopolis, yeah,
exactly. He has a great turn as an actor, even I'm sure more than once, but most memorably in To Die For.
Yeah, he's done. Yeah, that's the whole side of his career. He's been in a number of films. And he's, you know, he's kind of a striking presence in movies as an actor. I mean, I don't.
Did you ever talk about that?
We really. I mean,
more of a.
We really didn't. I mean, it was sort of clear that he would do these things for fun. You know, it wasn't very important to him, but he was friends with directors, and he would get asked to be in something and would enjoy it.
Right. It was more like almost like stunt casting. Only maybe the stunt was more for like an inside thing. That rather than, you know, like most people probably don't recognize him,
right,
or maybe even his name,
right, exactly.
But you know, those who do enjoy that quite a bit, you know, to see David Cronenberg. When, as a matter of fact, the first time I saw To Die For when it came out, I didn't know who he was. I mean, I knew who he was, but I didn't know what he looked like, or didn't notice his name in the credits. I don't even know if he's in the credits.
See. Yeah,
he might even be credited. But then when I, you know, saw it again, you know, it was like knocked off my plate. I was like, wow, I don't remember that.
yeah.
Anyway, but I'm a big fan, and there's been a few of his films. I will say, like, you know, I think I got in waves. You know, every certain number of films would go by, and then there would be one he did. And this is the kind of career that I really can respect, because, you know, like there were a few films, and then all of a sudden Naked Lunch really just, that film really connected with me. Like I was not expecting what ended up happening. I was really just, he had worked this out, you know, so a real authentic way of telling Naked Lunch that wasn't like the book.
Right.
But, yeah, obviously, but, you know, it was so well executed. I think that film is maybe I don't know if it's appreciated. I would say it's underappreciated.
I mean, it's hard to say. It was a big moment for him. I mean, when I went back and looked at press coverage, there were, you know, it was 20th Century Fox. There was a lot of press. He did a lot of interviews.
Okay.
I mean, I have. There's a piece that I love of, you know, where Gary Indiana, who's a Village Voice writer, went up on set, and it's, you know, basically an account on being on set. He talks to William Burroughs before he gets to interview Cronenberg. Yeah, but it was weird. Like I didn't love Naked Lunch at first because you're so, if you read the Burroughs novel, it's such a powerful thing. And of course, what Cronenberg realized was that you can't do the novel. So you do, you know, so what he did was a film about the writing of the novel and and it's about the artistic process. And it's a film that sort of alternates between New York, a real New York City, and then, this world where the story unfolds in Morocco is all, it's all internal,
Right.
it's again one of these films where it's all happening inside the mind of the writer. And yeah, and and also, I mean, and then the other big, thing to talk about with that is that, Cronenberg, there's a lot of discussion around the time of Naked Lunch of, is Cronenberg the right director to do a film that deals with homosexuality and deals with this sort of transgressive kind of sexuality? Cronenberg is always like, his perspective is that of a heterosexual male artist, who's certainly explored very interesting and unconventional sexual subject matters, and Crash is probably an even more subversive film than Naked Lunch. And that, that's been interesting, just the freedom that Cronenberg has taken to explore new forms of sexuality, his whole, and transgressive forms, is that's an interesting part of his career and part of his artistic project, and he says something in the book, he's very succinct about it, it's like he it's his art being so transgressive is what keeps him sane, like exploring these like dark territories allows him to stay sane, and being so sane allows him to sort of be free enough to go into this imaginary world. It reminds me a little bit of Stanley Kubrick, who was asked if he took drugs, when he was making 2001. And of course, Kubrick said, no, I never take drugs. Like that would ruin, I have to be lucid and clear while I'm creating art,
Yeah.
in order to make a movie that feels, 2001, which feels like a trip, it's far out. It's a liberated film, but you have to be, you don't achieve that by dropping acid and going.
You tell it soberly.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess you could also argue that both the Dead Ringers and even M Butterfly also explore the sexuality component.
Exactly. I mean, I think you have, with Dead Ringers, and it's like, one thing I appreciate more and more as I watch Cronenberg is the command he has over performance. And performance is, and Jeremy Irons in Dead Ringers is just one of the great screen performances, because he's playing, he plays two doctors, Beverly and Elliot. He plays twin gynecologists, and they're very, very different. And one is sort of experiments with drugs and has a much more free spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And Beverly is very controlled,
conservative.
And, and there's a war between the two of them, but they kind of trade off in a way during the film. And just the way that Jeremy Irons is playing two different people who are opposites and have these competing impulses. And, when you I've seen the film a few times, like you always know which one he's playing, and it's done in a very subtle way. It's like really an amazing.
I have to go back and watch that particular one, because that I saw also in the theaters when it came out. But as I looking through your book, I realized just how many of his movies I saw upon release. I mean, I guess I don't necessarily represent the average moviegoer. I don't know. I mean, there was a period where he was really was popular. He's come in and let me rephrase that. That sounds terrible. He's come in and out of vogue like anybody with a long career, Yeah,
I mean, that's interesting. He I guess, I mean, maybe people would say was, in vogue with History of Violence, but
yeah,
he, Naked Lunch marked a turning point, because the early films, he basically tended to write them himself. I mean, The Dead Zone was an adaptation of a Stephen King novel, but movies like They Came From Within and The Brood and Scanners and Rabid and Videodrome, were originals, you know, and it was written and directed by Cronenberg. And then he started doing adaptations. And, you know, you sort of think differently about a director who's adapting other material. And the early films were, he was working within a genre, and there was a very devoted fan base for that genre, you know, of horror movies. And then I feel like I was never really sure what his base was or what the audience was from Naked Lunch and beyond. You know, he was, because he was doing adaptations, but he wasn't.
But did you talk to him about that? About
Yeah, I mean,
why he started doing adaptations? Like when he, clearly there was a roadmap there, right? As an auteur.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about it a fair amount throughout the book, and because the whole, you know, I think what he became really interested in was and especially with Naked Lunch, was this, you know, idea of transformation, that you have an artist who has created a work of art, and then Cronenberg is going to take that and turn it into something else.
Right.
You know, and if you think about and this is sort of a core
very
subject
meta,
of
right?
his films, because if you think about The Fly, you know, you have the scientist Jeff Goldblum, and he gets merged with an actual insect, and then you have a new creature. And this idea of two things coming together and creating something new that's neither one or the other has been really intriguing to him. So he's worked with some really strong writers, and it's been, you know, it's usually been an interesting. There's been an interesting like tension between the different artists. You know, I mean, Maps to the Stars. You've got the Bruce Wagner novel, which feels, you know, the written novel feels like a satire of Hollywood. You know, then Cronenberg brings his own sensibility to that, and it's, you know, I think that is very much like a ghost movie. It's a movie that's filled with dream sequences and ghosts, you know, characters who come back from the dead somehow, and that, I think that's his sensibility. And there's like a clash between Cronenberg's sensibility and Bruce Wagner's that's I thought was really interesting. But I think that was a film that people couldn't quite put their, you know, figure it out what it was exactly.
Yeah.
But, and it's a pretty far out movie.
He's not pandering. You can't accuse him of that.
He definitely does not pander. And then he, you know, then he wrote a novel, Consume, where he got to really explore. You know, I think he's like always wanted to write. You know, he, you know, you get the feeling that his favorite novelist was Nabokov, but he never tried to adapt Nabokov, and maybe he just didn't, you know, maybe there just wasn't the right project, or there weren't the rights to something that he wanted to do. But it always sort of felt like he had a novel in him, and then he finally did, you know, write a novel that came out around the time of Maps to the Stars. You know, he's had some loss in the past few years. I mean, he lost his wife, who'd been married to for a long time. His sister, Denise Cronenberg, also died a few years ago. And she was an amazing costume designer, you know, who worked on his films. So he's, you know, that's been really difficult.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And lastly, can you just like, how did you end up publishing with University Press of Mississippi? Because, you know, I have a connection with that press through Sidney Stern, and
oh, right.
yeah.
Yes.
So, you know, it was nice to see this book come out.
Well, I'm
contacted
probably
me about it.
You know, there was a series of books that they do, University of Mississippi. It's a great series called Conversations with Filmmakers, and actually, like many years ago, I mean, I'm embarrassed probably if I think about how long ago this project started. It was probably, I feel like it's at least 10 years. The editor of that series at one point was Peter Brunette, who was a wonderful film critic who passed away a while ago. Now Gerald Perry edits the series.
Oh, sure, Gerald.
And I just, you know, I was asked to do following the Cronenberg interviews. I never really had the time to do it, but collected interviews over the years. And this book has a few long form interviews that I really love. There was a great book that came out in the 80s, the first important book about Cronenberg, called The Shape of Rage, which is by put together by Piers Handling, who was most famous as the longtime director of the Toronto Film Festival. But he was one of the first champions of Cronenberg's book. And there's a great interview that covers like the early life and career. It's a very long interview, and I was able to get rights to that. And then there's a terrific writer named David Breskin, who used to publish pieces in Rolling Stone, and he did an interview with Cronenberg for Rolling Stone about Naked Lunch. And when I approached him about publishing that, he said, well, I did a longer version for this book called Interviews. And I guess the Rolling Stone piece was a few thousand words, but the piece in the full-length version is like 30,000 words. It's
right.
And I got rights for that, and I just sort of went one by one. I wanted to have interviews that covered, went through the whole career. There's an interview about his book, and there's an interview, a really nice interview by Graham Fuller about Maps to the Stars. So the book really covers the whole career. But yeah, it just took a while to, get the permissions and put it together. And I had a little bit of time after, I had a full-time job at the Museum of the Moving Image until 2018. And I left the museum and actually had some time to finish this book.
So you gave yourself a little break before starting at the Paris?
I started, I got a job just before the pandemic with Netflix, and I'm programming the Paris Theater. And there was this in-between period when I was doing like a lot of different freelance projects, and I just said, this is when I want, this is my opportunity to like get this Cronenberg book done. And it happened, and I'm glad it happened.
Me too. Me too.
It's my first book. I mean, I haven't had time to do,
Do you see yourself doing some others?
Maybe. I liked it. I like the process. But all I can say, about what I'm doing now is pretty consuming, programming the Paris Theater. And that's all I want to focus on right now.
Well, yeah, it's a new thing, and it's a very remarkable time to start a job at a theater.
Exactly. Yeah, very weird time, but at some point, people will it will be back at normal. And it's very clear, like just from the bit I've seen, bit of evidence in the last month or so as theaters start to reopen, that people really want to go back. That's been the big topic in the past year. Like what are people going to go back into movie theaters?
And the answer is David Schwartz.
I would say yes. I mean, I think right now what's very clear is people want to go back to restaurants and bars. Those are all crowded. But
well, those are, the solutions for those places could be a little less expensive than for a movie theater.
Yeah.
How many seats at the Paris?
Oh, like over 500, 540.
Yeah. So, it's a good sized theater. I was just thinking, I've kind of gotten involved with these guys up here at the Upstate Films, which are these. Oh,
I love them. Upstate Films. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. So, we're doing a big outdoor, like rooftop films, but, optimizing this area of the Hudson Valley, outdoor spaces and partnerships. I mean, they're being very ambitious, and I've been, connected. I connected with them pretty quick because I was already worried about the survival of these little art houses. And, I was like, when I moved here, I was like, I want to really help with the Upstate Films because they're going to be my local art houses, And
that's
so
great. Yeah,
I'm going to be, hopefully I'm doing some programming with these guys. So I'm very.
Oh, great.
happy to have kind of gotten some already planting some roots up here.
Oh, that's great.
But those theaters compared to the Paris, they're very small, and the expense of maybe having to rehaul or an HVAC system or something is like, it's a burden, like on a level.
It's amazing. I mean, there's this organization called Art House Convergence.
Right. Sure.
And I went to the conference a few years ago, and you just hear so many stories about these little theaters all over the country that manage to like find a way to to raise the money and keep running. And there's such a desire for people to have these theaters. It's
now more than ever. It could.
Maybe I think that could be true. Like I certainly everybody's learned what they can watch on their own TVs, and I'm amazed at how much I've been able to have access to on all these different services, Criterion and Mubi and all, there's so many.
Yeah.
You can do so much online. It's amazing, but people want to be in a theater.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I think I'm not really concerned about that. Like, I know people do want to return to the theaters, and as soon as it's safe, they will.
Yes.
That's the whole thing.
As soon as people are, a lot of people tell me that they, once they're vaccinated, they'll go.
Yeah.
So it's coming. It's taken a while, but.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks.
People can buy where books are sold.
Yeah, we all know where to go to buy books these days, but
exactly.
But thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, and good luck with your cinema.
Thank you, and I love talking. Yeah, I love talking. It's a great excuse to talk about a great filmmaker. I love these opportunities to. I have not done an episode on David Cronenberg, so it's a pleasure. And
great,
to reconnect is nice. It's very nice.
Yeah, great to see you, and thanks so much.
And I'll come down to the Paris.
Please do. Okay, thanks. Take it easy.
All right, enjoy the rest of your week.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right, David. Take care.